Welcome to the world building session. Today we are going to be working on something that I am, at least for the moment, calling fantasy vistas. And it's basically scenes like this. In fact, if you give me just a moment, I'll pull out my world building sketchbook proper and I can show you some of these. These are the kinds of things I'm talking about, as well as kind of the intro for the region that I have right here. These little vistas give us the chance to basically explore a little bit more thoroughly. The maps are great. I think they're really intriguing, but sometimes these things are just way more rewarding. They're way more fun to work on, and you communicate a little bit more about a region or a people from those kinds of things sometimes than from others. So I have a tendency to work on things like this, and the train of thought is basically this gives me a different insight into the people group that I'm working with. So today we're going to be working on some of those. And I did just a little bit of sketching for these yesterday to make sure that they're prepped, so I'm not spending the whole time working on the basics. I find that that works better. But as we get started today, let me know what you're working on for your world building right now. Are you designing cities, characters, creatures, whatever it is? I would love to hear about it, along with a brief description. This has been kind of the stuff I've been working on. Primarily, I've been focusing on Nedaria, on this seafaring region, which I shared in one of the past segments. And also these crabs, because crabs are cool. All right, let's go back to Hyoku. And that's the name of this particular region. This is my first page I'm working on for it. So I'm trying to keep my expectations low so I don't put myself in a place where I'm immediately disappointed by what I'm working on. So this is kind of a super zoomed out version of this region. It is essentially a giant bluff coming out of the, not really a desert floor, but what used to be a massive canyon. And there's these massive trees on top of that area. In fact, since these were sketched yesterday and are thoroughly dry, we can go ahead and erase some of these lines. And maybe we'll just start with some color on these. When I start working on these fantasy vistas, I generally try to give myself just a little bit of an understanding of what the area is. And then I start with grays to just start working in the value structures on the space that I'm working on. I find that this, again, just alleviates some of the stress that might come along with the process. And maybe when you're world building, you don't encounter much. I find that I don't encounter a lot of world building stress when I'm working on things that are new, things that aren't attached to anything else. However, when I am working on ideas that have been in my brain for a very long time, I do find that I have some level of stress about it. I've got expectations for how I want these things to turn out, and it's hard to detach from those entirely. All right, well, I'm going to start with these guys. I'm going to start working in on some of the darker areas while I talk about this. So this is a tall forest, very tall. It is a counterpoint to another forest that I have in my story, which is mostly like a rainforest. This one, I have not yet entirely decided, as you might be able to tell by these trees here, what kind of trees there actually are in this forest. I call them the rain trees, R-E-I-N, in the story, but I don't really perfectly have it figured out yet what they are. Originally, they were going to be kind of inspired by Lothlorien, and were going to be deciduous trees that lose their leaves, though I think ironically the Malorn trees don't lose their leaves or don't lose them until the last minute. But that was kind of the idea initially. The more that I've, focused on it and spent time thinking, I kind of wonder if pine trees might be better, almost like the trees in the Pacific Northwest, where you get the sequoias and the redwoods and whatnot that are just these incredibly large trees. And I think as of right now, that is what I am kind of tending toward. But we'll see. I try nowadays not to marry myself too much as I'm in the early stages of world building, because I find that when I do that, I accidentally forget to consider other options. And that's generally not a great thing. I want to, at the beginning stages especially, allow myself to consider as many options as possible, because that's where the kind of creativity and invention comes from, is from allowing yourself to consider many different ideas. This brush pen is technically lighter than the one I was just working on, but not much. So these are some new guys that I haven't put a ton of time into yet, so getting some practice in. I like the brush pens for this. I think the undeniable best way to do this would actually be to do it digitally, but I don't know. Something about working analog, especially with this kind of stuff, is just better in my mind. Not like strategically. I think strategically it's not a great choice, but art is not about being perfectly efficient all the time. It is about something deeper that we all kind of innately understand, but struggle to define. I like doing this kind of thing, though, because I find, for me at least, it's so much easier to wrap my head around the world I'm working on and the ideas I'm talking about when I have something visual to look at. And while working top-down or designing creatures can be fun, I find that for my brain, working on the actual location that things take place seems to just be a better way to do it. And so these are often the kind of sketches that I put together. In fact, these are probably the most frequent sketches I've done over my lifetime when it comes to world building. For me, it's just that they're lower stress. These are very zoomed out, so there's not a lot of detail that you got to get in there. You're mostly working on compositional elements, making sure things function at some level, but you're not trying to do everything at once. I think most of us have something like this. For a lot of people, it's characters and figures. For me, it's often dragons and robots. And when it comes to world building stuff, it's generally things like this. So I'd love to hear whatever yours is, though. If you have one area that you kind of return to that's your low stress, just in general, but man, especially if it comes to world building stuff. So let me know. But I'm just kind of working on this. This would be looking from the south up at Hyoku. The forest would kind of go much larger than you see right there. And then down here is kind of the global view, how it might look from very far away. Of course, it would be way cooler if it was mostly like enshrouded in fog. And honestly, there is a lot of fog down in these areas. These are kind of some weird lowlands. It's one of the first times in the book that I get into this fantasy of plants as the main group kind of hangs out there in the evening, and then they wake up. It's like, I'm pretty sure the plants are in different places than when we went to sleep. And sure enough, there's the plants are moving, whether they're actually plants or like semi-magical in nature. We don't really know. At least I don't know yet, and so therefore the characters don't know. I also do that a lot in my storytelling. I keep things vague and mysterious. Sometimes it's because I'm still working out the details and it's stuff that I'll shore up later. But a lot of times not. A lot of times even the stuff that I have really thought about, I just have decided I'm going to keep vague because the real world is vague. And you've probably heard me talk about that here or on other channels as well about, not me on other channels, but other people about world building in general, is that a sense of mystery seems to be a fundamental component of good world building. Because if you have a world that is entirely understood, unless you have a really good story reason for that, it just doesn't feel believable. Because we don't understand all of our world. We are still finding new things out all the time. And so it seems just not particularly believable. It's like, yes, this is the magic system, and here is 100% of every single aspect of how it works, unless, like, the creator of said magic system is still around and alive. If you have a sci-fi book where you're explaining everything that has to do with a technology, but, like, the person who's explaining it is the person who invented it, fine. But if you were, reading the first Dune book and everything about the spice melange is explained, then it just doesn't feel believable. It is a mysterious thing, and mystery helps keep the fantastic elements going. And I think honestly for science fiction that's the case too, because Sci-fi is about the improbable, about things that either haven't happened yet or might not ever happen, unstable futures. And there needs to be some element of believability to really make it convincing. I think that's the fun part about it. Though, admittedly, I haven't read a ton of sci-fi in the last, decade. What are some of your favorite science fiction books? Mine in general is Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard. It's an excellent book, although I know the man himself was rather dubious. But the book is really good. The Mote in God's Eye is another of mine that is a really big favorite. Starship Troopers I read by audiobook way back in the day when it was actually books on tape. That was pretty good too. And, Dune, if you consider Dune a sci-fi, which I am not 100% sure I do. I think honestly I consider Dune to be far more of a fantasy book than a science fiction book. But that might be somewhat controversial. I think there's a lot of people who would come to blows about that. I'm not sure this is quite the right tone for these. Let's see if we've got something that works a little better. Yeah. I think those two will work in tandem really well. It's kind of this red, sedimentary stone is what I think of. I don't know exactly how these vistas are going to appear, but this is how I find I need to start things. And I'd recommend that you do something similar if you have locations that you're world building. Maybe it's a spaceport, maybe it's a new planet. I think this kind of drawing and sketching is really good because it gives you a sense of exploration. You as the writer, as the artist, are able to start putting things down and exploring what they feel like. And you'll often sort through what works with your ideas and what doesn't work in these kinds of sessions. That's certainly what I've found, is that when I start sketching things out, I will frequently come to realizations like, oh, that idea that I thought was so clever and good is just not going to work out that well. And that's probably the most beneficial thing about this. Whether you're writing or putting together a campaign for, 5e or Pathfinder, or working on building a video game or whatever it might be. I find that the world building is just advantageous. It adds so much to those things. Though I've been thinking about this a bit more too, and I actually have a podcast that I'm probably going to record later on today. Today is April 2nd, 2025. But I'm going to record it, and it's basically making the case that even if you're not telling a story, that as an artist in general, I think it might be a good idea for everyone to just take some time and world build. And I'm not sure that it's 100% true, I'm not married to it yet, but I find that when I have an idea like that, I kind of need to almost play devil's advocate and just go out on that limb and be like, yes, I think this is good. Everyone should do this. Because in that conversation, the comments that I'll get back, but also the thought that I have to go through is going to reveal how much of that's true and how much of that's not. But I do have a suspicion that that actually is the case. That regardless of what kind of art you work on, I think there's a good case to be made that world building is going to be a good thing for your art. And I've been thinking about this, I work in a little local gallery with a lot of artists that are, in their 50s or 60s. And I was trying to think about it from their perspective. Would it be beneficial to them to world build? And, I think the ones among them that are more creative, the ones that enjoy the art not just as this is what I do to make money and, as a kind of profession, I think the other ones really would get something out of it. I think it naturally promotes creativity, and I think that it promotes creativity in different ways than a lot of your other art would. But that's kind of a harder case to make, I think, for older folks that have been doing the same thing for a long time, and that's what they're doing. But I think it's not a bad idea to even try there, to just see if I can make a decent case for that. I certainly at present believe that if you are a young artist who has any potential aspiration to do something artistic for a career, but also if you're somebody who just enjoys it and wants to get better and maybe daydreams about putting together a video game or writing a novel or something, I do think for you, if that's you, I think it's 100% worthwhile. Because it's just not that big a waste of time. Like, even if it goes nowhere, like if this sketchbook here goes nowhere, well, but that's not totally true, because I'm in no danger of stuff going nowhere, because I'm already writing my novels, and hypothetically I should finish the second book here in a couple weeks, though my writing rate has gone down a little bit. I was averaging close to 1,200 words a day. I'm down now to about 1,020, which is not a big difference until you look at the fact that I'm trying to finish this novel, which is going to end up being about 280,000 words, and the next is probably going to be comparable, if not bigger. So when you think about it that way, it's like, oh yeah, that will dramatically change the amount of time. But let's just go with that for a second. Even if all of this didn't go anywhere, as far as I wasn't writing my novels, I was just playing and building these things, it's fun, first of all. Second, I'm studying things. Right now I'm not. When I first do the first iteration of these Vistas, I generally don't look much up. But the last session where I was working on domesticated animals, I went and did little bits of research and looked up some sheep and worked from them. And often that's how these kinds of things work. But even if you didn't do that, you're just working on drawing things and putting things together. And in so doing, you're analyzing and thinking about the world around you, and you're gaining an appreciation for it, and you're developing a skill. And if you are watching this video, there is almost 100% chance that you are an artist and a creative. And so you have a desire to create things, to build things, to get better at building things, to build different things than what you're building right now, or to just progress in the things that you're working on right now. And world building is going to benefit 100% of those things. I really do think so. I really, really think that it is going to be massively advantageous for you. But I suppose I'm getting a little bit off topic, if topic is even something we could say we had here. There's an idea with all of this that I am experimenting with a new region, essentially. And that's why I think this is one of the best things to do when you start working on a story or a world building project, is make these kind of fantasy vistas, because they're generally way lower stress than the big, this is the sigil of this, group of knights, or these are the epic swords that my story is going to revolve around. Those things, cool, very cool, and so stressful. If you mess them up, it's just gonna weigh on you forever. So starting with things like this, where it's just lower stakes, and you're starting to sift through the pieces and think about, what does this look like in different climates over the course of the year? What are the kind of animals that live here? The kind of plants that live here? Those kinds of things are just, they're easier. This is such a good place to start. So I would encourage you to start with this kind of stuff. It's just, man, it's relaxing. I'm just having fun. This is just rewarding. I kind of like this brighter color here. I think it's the same thing with writing, though. I find that when I just don't let myself succumb to the pressure and stress of the writing, and I just sit down and actually write, cool stuff happens. And it's hard to predict what that cool stuff is going to be until I'm actually in it and writing. I end up creating characters I didn't plan on. I end up including ideas and conversations and dialogue I didn't plan on. And, generally writers are broken into these camps of pantsers and planners or gardeners and architects. Those, kind of separations are not perfect, obviously, and they're not always helpful. I find that, most people who know me as a writer consider me a planner because I've got all these spreadsheets for how I put things together. But ironically, the way I think about it is I plan so that I can pants. I like the idea of being a gardener, but like even a good gardener is always going to plan. They're always going to make sure that things are set up to let the plants thrive and do what they want to. And that's kind of how I think about my writing and world building is I like to plan things, but I try to set up all the pieces so that when I start writing, the characters are free to be organic versions of themselves, that they will do things I don't expect. I will get characters who will sacrifice themselves or make decisions in dialogue. And that's like, wow, when I sat down and put this together, I didn't anticipate that was going to happen. And I've talked to some people who think that's like really weird. Or like, but you're the writer. How can your characters do things that you didn't, plan for or intend? It's like, it's almost like a strange kind of empathy. You're creating an artificial being and then trying your best to get inside their head, to think about them as being a real living thing. And when you do that, you do start to extricate maybe pieces of your own humanity into those characters. And so it doesn't seem totally irrational that they do things that you weren't anticipating. I mean, if you've ever done any programming, especially for like video games and stuff, there's a good chance that the AI that you build will actually do things that like were not intended, but technically make sense with the rule set that you gave, whatever that is. It's not like creating progeny. It is, but it is not like 100% divorced from that either. It's something different. And so when I sit down to do these sessions, I have a plan, but I often don't plan perfectly. I like to let the, creativity kind of push me and, take me in directions. And sometimes it's directions as simple as like my wrist was moving that way, and so the mark that I made came out that way. Sometimes it's more as I'm having these conversations and I'm thinking about things, I'll go, oh, like this is also logical to try out now that I'm over here. It's almost like you plan a vacation and like you're going to go to this place and you plan what you're going to do there. But once you're there, like there are new inputs and you take in new ideas and you go, well, this also makes sense. I should do this while I'm here. Probably a little bit more complicated than that, but that's not a terrible analog for things. I find that during these sessions, I do have new ideas though, even while I'm recording, which is, obviously I'm thinking a little bit less about what I'm doing because I have to think about what I'm talking about. But I really like the current strategy. I can't talk always while I'm doing these too. I like the current strategy that I have though, where I will kind of come up with an idea I want to talk about in one of these sessions. I'll go do some preparatory sketching ahead of time just to make sure things are started, because I think that probably makes it a lot more entertaining for y'all. And then I will allow myself more free rein to do things. I am curious though, like when you guys are listening to this or watching these, are you actually watching everything I'm doing? Are you, just listening to this while you draw or listening to this while you do the dishes or something? I'm just curious. A lot of the watching of videos I do is that way. I don't watch a lot by just sitting down and watching things. I almost always just listen. But I am really curious about what you guys do. If you're here, we're 20 some odd minutes in. Are you actually watching every stroke I'm making? Please let me know, because I'm curious about it, but also like if everyone's actually watching every mark I'm making and all that, like maybe there are some different choices I could make to make this better serve each of you. Ironically, though, this is the third or fourth iteration I've done of this on this page. I think this is the most helpful. for me at least. The Far Vista does a lot more for me as far as understanding this area that I'm working on. And these trees too. But the first thing I'm thinking about with these trees is like, how big are they? In my mind originally, I was thinking like 600 feet. I think the biggest trees we have on Earth right now are close to 300, but I should be able to do some quick research on that when I'm going through the editing and then post it on the screen. So if you're curious about that, take a peek. General Sherman, I know, is one of the largest trees ever recorded, or perhaps the largest tree ever recorded. And I'll put on some of the details on those kind of things on the screen. But if that's true, and the biggest trees we know about are about 300 feet tall, then 600 doesn't seem ridiculous for fantasy. It feels like a 2,000 or 3,000 foot tall tree might be kind of nuts, and sometimes that's fine. It's not like everything has to be perfectly in line with what can logically happen. If you're working on a fantasy world, it is a fantasy world. Let it be fantasy, but just make sure that if you have things like that and everything else follows really strict rules about biology that are in line with what our world is, that won't quite blend in and make sense. Unless you're doing a Discworld thing like Terry Pratchett did, where you have lots of logical right next to lots that makes almost no sense. I've got a couple of his books, or at least one, I guess, that I need to read. I've not read any Terry Pratchett, but I've heard enough about him where I do assume that I will probably like his work. He seems like a very goofy and interesting fellow. Though I think he's passed now. He's no longer with us. But I suppose that's the way all great authors go eventually. Oh wait, that's just the way all humans go. So, I love trees. Man, I'm getting better at drawing trees. They're very hard for me. I've done a couple of videos on them, which was half just excuse for me to finally take some time and learn how to draw trees. But they've always been super, super hard for me to work on. I'm going back through right now and I'm just putting on the chunks that would hypothetically be where the tree is wrapping around back behind where we can see. But yeah, they've always been really difficult for me, but I'm slowly feeling like I'm getting a handle on things, and that's really lovely because, I'm sorry, too many trains of thought as I was starting to talk there. I just finished my 4th read of The Lord of the Rings yesterday, and getting to spend a little bit more time with Treebeard right at the end when he has his final drink with Merry and Pippin, and just I love the trees and the forests and how much time Tolkien puts into describing all those fairly simple things that are less important on a grandiose scale, and yet it's the compilation of all those little things that tell us what is worth fighting for. If you think about your life right now, the things that you value and the things that are probably worth fighting for in your life are the small things. The ability to go, get a cup of coffee the way you want. The ability to sit and hang out with and spend time with your friends. The ability to draw what you want, to read what you want. To be able to walk back and forth and not be jeered at or made fun of or be subject to discrimination of some kind. That's the little things that are, often when you really think about them, not that little. What are the hobbits really fighting for as they go to try to save Middle-earth, and especially when they come back home at the end of The Lord of the Rings and have to retake their home? They're fighting for the ability to have a normal family, the ability to sit and smoke and drink and eat. Sam, after they clear Sauron out from the Shire, Sam spends his next year basically going back and forth and planting trees. Tolkien was, I don't know if he would have considered himself an environmentalist. He considered himself an anarchist, so perhaps. But you see in his books a tremendous love for the natural world and for trees. And I think in a lot of ways he's saying those are the things worth fighting for. And the Dunedain, who are Aragorn's people, when they talk about how little affection and love they've gotten from the Breelanders and the Hobbits for what they've done over the years, they say, it kind of sucks that we haven't gotten credit for all the protection that we give the Hobbits to keep all of the big folk out of their lands, but like we would have it be thus, that they don't know that they're being protected. There's a lot in this world worth fighting for, and the trees in the natural world, I think, are among them. And world building gives you a unique ability to get back in tune with those things. I can't imagine that when Tolkien was working on building Fangorn, the tragedy of the loss of the Entwives, that he wasn't thinking about the places that he grew up and the places that he loved and the places that he wishes that he could find or recover. He had to have been thinking about those things. There's probably, though he was very much against, allegory, he wasn't against, similarity and rhythm. And I don't know specifically what the tragedy of the loss of the Entwives might be applying to, if anything, but it has similarities in his life. He was an orphan. He grew up in South Africa for a little while and then was in England and raised by, other folks. And he watched as he grew up in World War I and World War II, the loss of the natural world and industrialization taking over these beautiful swaths of Britain that he loved. And world building gives you an ability to dive back into those things, to find the things that you find most valuable and to draw attention to them, to restore them, to kindle them, to hold on to them, to put them in an imperishable medium. Because the real world can break. But if you record something in song, in verse, in poetry, in art, it is now preserved in a different fashion. I didn't necessarily intend for this to go in a deep place. It's one of the interesting parts of recording these sessions like this. But I do think there is something noble about world building, because in general, you are looking at the things that you love and appreciate in the world, and you're building new versions of them. Or maybe your world is tragic, and you're building the world that you would like to see, but there's nothing less human about that. That's also important. And so what does this say about me? That I love trees and forests, that I grew up in California and then, where we had the giant oak forests and savannas, that I spent time in Ohio growing up. And I loved the forests and going and exploring and finding salamanders and newts and turtles and frogs and getting enough frogs to fill a 5-gallon bucket and throwing them at my cousin. All kinds of stupid, fun stuff. And I long for that in some way. I live in Colorado now, and we just don't have deciduous forests. We have the alpine forests here, but they're rather devoid of life compared to the ones that I grew up in. And I miss those. And now that I'm raising a kid, I miss it vicariously for her. I wish she would have access to those things, and she doesn't. And maybe we'll move at some point. Maybe we'll just go on trips. But there is a nostalgia that I have, and I think that's where it comes from in my novels and in my world building. I long for trees. Spring is upon us now in Colorado, and we've had a couple days of rain, and the outside world is responding. I have flowers coming up, and I am overjoyed to see them piercing through. Well, as always, thanks for being here. I'm really curious about your thoughts. I've asked for, comments a couple times on this video, not because I'm trying to get the engagement, but just because I am desperately curious about your perspective on this and on all these things. So thank you for your participation there, and thank you for being here. Thank you to my patrons as well, who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out my Patreon and you would, be so kind as to support me, that would be wonderful. It's linked below, right next to the Discord, which is just a lovely small community where we can hang out, share our artwork, and the things that we're excited about. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon. And go thank a tree today.